Good afternoon and welcome to Orkney International Science Festival 2022 in this Scotland's Year of Stories. My name is Eric Walker and it's my pleasure to be hosting this session featuring the John and Anne Cumming Memorial Lecture. Our speaker today is Professor Terry Brown. Terry is Emeritus Professor of Biomolecular Archaeology at the University of Manchester, having retired from full-time research in 2019. Most of his research has been on the origin and development of prehistoric agriculture, in particular, the ways in which barley and wheat adapted to having to change to climates over the past few thousand years. Today, Terry tells the story of the origins of Orkney's six-road barley, Bere, and its evolution over the centuries. It's been grown in Orkney for over 4,000 years, so I'm expecting quite a tale to be told today. Now, I want to encourage you all to take part in this event and ask you to please enter your comments and questions in YouTube's live chat, and also on our new slick system called Slido. Now, simply point your smartphone or tablet camera at the QR code you can see on the screen, and it will take you to the question and answer area, or visit www.slido.com and enter the code 3435541. Then you can easily enter your questions and comments, which I'll present to Terry after he's completed his talk. Terry, it's over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Eric, for the introduction, and it's excellent to have this opportunity to talk today about some of the latest discoveries about Bere barley, Orkney's ancient grain. If I can have the next slide, please. So this is an example of Bere barley growing earlier this year on Orkney. As Eric mentioned, it's a six-row barley, which contrasts to the simpler two-row barley, which are also grown by farmers. And the difference is simply in the seed head. A six-row barley has got 6 rows of seeds, and a two-row barley has got 2 rows of seeds. And also, Bere barley is a hulled barley, which means that the seeds are fairly tightly enclosed in the seed cases, and the barley has to be threshed in order to release the seed, in order to produce flour and other products. Have the next slide, please. So, Bere barley is a 6-row hulled type of barley. Next slide. With also other very interesting properties. It gives extremely good yields on nutrient-poor soils compared to other barleys. And recent research, which the Agronomy Institute in Orkney, along with the University of Copenhagen and the James Hutton Institute in Dundee have carried out, suggests that Bere is particularly good at absorbing manganese and other trace elements from the soil, which gives it an advantage compared to most other types of barley. It's able to grow on sandy soils, for example, which are found in marginal areas such as in the Scottish Islands. And the next slide, another extremely interesting and valuable feature of Bere barley is that it has a relatively high growth rate, a short period between sowing and harvesting. And in some years, it's possible to sow the seed and then harvest the grain just 115 days later, which is about 2 or 3 weeks less than for other types of barley. This is obviously an advantage in northern latitudes where there's a relatively short growing period. Next slide, please. So Bere barley was originally popular for the crofting type of subsistence, where it could be grown at small scale without the need to improve the soil to any huge amount, and could also obtain the crop fairly routinely, even if the growing season was quite short. This is an example of crofting in Ardgour near Fort William. Next slide, please. So Bere was cultivated quite extensively throughout Scotland and the Scottish Islands through the 19th century. Next slide. But during the 20th century, there was a gradual decline. And this was for probably a combination of factors. First of all, other types of barley were grown which were considered more suitable for distilling. changes in agricultural economics meant that potatoes and sheep became more popular for small-scale farming rather than barley. And for these reasons, the growth of beer became restricted, died out more or less in Scotland, and became restricted to the Western Islands, Orkney, and Shetland. Next slide. Which meant that by the start of the 21st century, 20 years ago, it almost died out, almost become extinct, with just a few hectares grown annually in Orkney and Caithness, and a few more in the Western Islands. But these amounts are really little more than a few small holdings. However, we have the next slide. There was a tremendous transition occurring and a recovery of beer, reinterest in beer during the early parts of the current century. And this was for three reasons. The first of these was Barony Mills here in Birsay grew beer continually and milled beer to produce a few products. And they essentially kept the growth of beer going during the worst periods when it was in decline. Next slide. Additionally, from 2002, the Orkney College, which is part of the University of Highlands and Islands, in particular Peter Martin and his colleagues, started to cultivate beer experimentally in order to understand its growth properties. It was their work which showed that its ability to absorb trace elements very effectively, and also to see whether there might be some interesting properties within beer barley which might be bred into other types of barley. And this has, again, increased the interest in barley. And then finally, on the next slide, the people of Orkney have really kept beer alive because of their understanding and interest and affinity with their history and their heritage, and their willingness to purchase the products which are being made from beer. So various the bread, the beer meal, oat cakes and such like, quite a range of products produced from the flour which is being grown at the Barony Mills. And additionally, on the next slide, the interesting development of the use of beer barley to produce whiskey. This is the Bruichladdich distillery, which is on Islay, which have started to use beer barley to produce award-winning whiskies. And because whiskies are drunk all over the world, not just in Scotland and Ireland and England and the rest of Europe, but in America and Japan and such like, this has spread the word about beer barley, so it's become well known, not just in Orkney, northern Scotland. Because of this, there's been a resurgence in the growth and the use of beer barley, and now it's become a very interesting crop, which a lot of people are studying. So move on to the next slide. The question is, however, where does beer come from? What's the origins of beer barley? And the tradition in Scotland, in Orkney, certainly for some time, is that it's a Viking barley, that beer barley was brought to Orkney by the Vikings during the period when they expanded out from their homelands in Scandinavia throughout a large part of Europe and North America. And as well as coming to Orkney, arriving there probably during the 9th century, the early 800s, the Vikings also traveled tremendously around the Northern Hemisphere, across to Iceland, settled Greenland during the late medieval warm period, quite probably also established a settlement on Newfoundland, and then also traveled in the other direction all the way around the Mediterranean, around Spain, Portugal into the Mediterranean, and down the river systems of Europe to the Black Sea, the Caspian Sea. So a tremendous movement of the Vikings all over the Northern Hemisphere. Next slide, please. But in particular, the Vikings established communities on Orkney, on northern Scotland, the Western Islands, and down as far as the Isle of Man and the Dublin area of Ireland. And in this area, Orkney was probably of central importance. And so because there was clearly a large movement of Viking peoples to Orkney, it was quite possible that they brought with them commodities such as beer barley, and therefore perhaps beer is a Viking barley. However, we have to consider other alternatives. One thing which is important to recognize is that barley was grown on Orkney before the Vikings arrived. The Vikings certainly weren't the first people to cultivate barley. Have the next slide, please. And we know this because of the archaeological record. These are examples of burnt barley grains from various archaeological sites in Orkney. This is a kind of way in which cereals are preserved in the archaeological record as burnt seeds. We don't see intact plants of wheat or barley preserved at archaeological sites. They just decay. but occasionally seeds get burnt for some reason. A few cases of sort of dramatic events where a granary, which has been storing seeds over the winter, has burnt down. We don't actually see that on Orkney, but there are a few cases elsewhere in Europe where we can obtain immense amounts of archaeological grain. But alternatively, it may be that a grain just falls into fire or something, gets burnt in that way, and then is recovered thousands of years later by the archaeologists. And because this is obviously just a remnant of barley, we know that barley must have been cultivated at that site at that particular time. Next slide. And so we know that barley was grown in Orkney at the Neolithic period because remains such as I've shown you have been found, for instance, at Bere, which is dated back to 3000 BC, the Nap of Howard up in Papa Westray, which is a similar sort of period, and also Isbister, the Tomb of the Eagles, down in South Ronaldsay, it's also yielded barley. And there are probably 12 or 14 additional sites of Neolithic period, that kind of age, 5,000 years ago, in which barley was grown way, way, way before the Vikings arrived. The question is, though, was this barley the progenitor of beer, or was it replaced, or did it die out, or was it replaced by the barley which was brought by Vikings? So beer could still be a Viking introduction, even though barley was grown on Orkney earlier than that. The next slide, please. Now, the first indication that beer barley might in fact be a very ancient barley came from some really exciting work that was done by a good friend of mine, Michael Wallace, that time at the University of Sheffield, using geometric morphometrics in order to study the shapes of the grains. And geometric morphometrics is the method used for facial recognition by computers. And it's complicated in many respects, but simple in others. First of all, if you're looking at a human face, then certain positions on the face are marked by the computer on your passport photograph or whatever, which are positions which can be securely marked on any photograph of any human face, such as the corners of the eyes, points around the nose, the corners of the mouth, and such like. And then the distances between all of those points are then measured, and that data is then used to compare with the person standing at the e-passport gate to confirm that you are actually the person on the passport, and magically the doors open, or sometimes don't, but nonetheless, the computer can recognize your face because and distinguish it from all other faces because of the slight differences in the measurements between these key points. The next slide. What Michael did was to apply the same methodology to grains, both archaeological grains and modern grains, in order to get a mathematical description of the grain shape. And he did this by positioning points around the grain and then again measuring the distances between those points to get a mathematical description of the shape and morphology of the grain. Next slide, please. And okay, next slide, because we seem to have missed one here. Okay, go back, please. Okay, so a slide seems to be missing, but not to worry. So what the results of this showed was that, first of all, with modern grain, it's possible to distinguish between beer barley and Scandinavian barleys and barleys from the rest of Britain, because these have discretely different shapes, which can be distinguished using this geometric morphometrics method. If we come to the next slide, the second thing which, so that was with modern grain, we can distinguish modern grain using this method. Michael then tried to look at archaeological grain, such as the ones which I've shown you. And what these showed was that barley with a beer-like morphology, the shapes of the grain, which are fairly similar to modern beer, was present in Orkney since at least the Bronze Age. Some of the earlier Neolithic grain might have been different, but it was clear that the grain which was grown, the barley which was grown on Orkney during the Bronze Age, was similar to beer. Not necessarily the same, perhaps the progenitor, but clearly very similar. So that was the first indication that possibly beer is much older than a Viking introduction. Next slide, please. So that's when we became interested in attempting to use DNA to study beer and to address the same questions. And the first question we asked was whether ancient DNA could be obtained from these archaeological grains, from the Orkney grain from the Bronze Age and earlier, and whether we could use that DNA in order to study the archaeological remains and to ask whether they were genetically the same as beer or different to beer. Now, getting ancient DNA from charred grains like this is something which I've been trying to do since 1989. I first started doing that work. I started working on the archaeological grains from Orkney around about 10 years ago. And the general conclusion of all that 30 or 40 years of work was that sometimes with archaeological grains, it's possible to obtain DNA and then to do a certain amount of genetic analysis, but not always. Now, for the next slide, please. Sadly, with all of the grains from Orkney that I looked like, there wasn't any DNA present, couldn't extract any ancient DNA. And so that avenue of research became impossible. However, were we disheartened? To a certain extent we were, but there are other ways in which we can use DNA to study the evolution of agriculture and ways in which we can study whether beer was possibly grown in Orkney way before the Viking period. And that is simply to look at modern types of barley and to compare their DNA sequences and to look at their relationships. The next slide, please. So we started out a study which wasn't entirely novel. Other people, especially groups at the James Hutton Institute, had previously studied DNA in barley varieties, including beer. But we did a much larger study than had been done before, with 203 different wild varieties of barley, and then over 400 cultivated varieties, including 35, which were considered to be types of beer, 32 accessions from different parts of Scandinavia and Finland, and then 334 different varieties from different parts of Europe and the Near East. Now, one thing that's important to say is that, except for the beer, none of these barley varieties are currently cultivated. They all come from seed banks. They're varieties which were grown until maybe 100 years ago, but have since then been replaced by improved varieties from modern crop breeding. So this is ancient land races of barley which we're studying, not modern varieties, but nonetheless we can still study the relationships. Now, the next slide, please. So the first thing we did was to build a really large family tree. So this is just a tree showing the relationships between all of those different barley varieties. And it's drawn in a circle just to get it onto the slide. But you just follow the lines around to see which groups of barley are closely related. The color scheme is that the red barleys are the beers. The blue ones are ones from Scandinavia. The green are ones from Faroe Islands, which become interesting in a moment. The ones in magenta are from other parts of Britain, and the black ones are from all over Europe and elsewhere. First thing we see is that the beers are split into two groups, which are labeled Group 1 and Group 2. Group 2 are varieties which are called beer, but which we think aren't actually related to Orkney beer or to regular Scottish beer. The word beer is actually the Anglo-Saxon word for barley. And so some old varieties from Britain are called beer, even though they might not be the same as what we think of as beer in Orkney. So those Group 2 varieties I'm not going to talk about anymore because we think they're probably just regular ancient British varieties. If we have the next slide, we zoom in on that part of the family tree which has the main beer barleys. The first thing we notice is something which was previously been recognized from other DNA studies, again at the James Hutton Institute, is that there's a small group of barleys from the Faroe Islands which are very closely related, in fact cluster in within the beer barleys. The next slide, please. And there are various hypotheses as to why this might be the case. Michael Wallace, who recognized this first of all, suggested that it might be that fishermen from the Faroe Islands visited the Orkney Islands in the early part of the 20th century and returned with stocks of barley, stocks of beer grain to supplement the barley which was being grown on the Faroe Islands. Agriculture or the growth of barley is marginal, very marginal in the Faroe Islands. We're not certain whether it could have occurred continuously over the last few centuries. It might have been that the stocks had to be continually supplemented from other places. An alternative hypothesis is that, in fact, the grain on the Faroe Islands was introduced there by the Vikings because they moved from Orkney to the Faroes, colonized the Faroes later on. And so possibly the Vikings took beer barley to the Faroe Islands. But it's interesting that the Faroe Islands barleys, which were not recognized actually as being beer, do appear to be very closely related to beers from Orkney and the Shetlands and the Western Islands. The other point which we can see from this slide is that the beers and the Scandinavian barleys are obviously very closely related. Have the next slide, please. So there's a point here where the family tree between the Bere and the Scandinavian barleys diverge. Now, the difficulty with studying DNA and evolutionary relationships in this way is that you can always interpret things in different manners. And often a problem is that you have your own pet theory and you look at the DNA data and you can kind of make the DNA data fit in theory, whichever way you want it to be. Now, what we see here isn't really diagnostic of Bere either being a Viking introduction or being a more ancient type of barley. However, if Bere had been introduced into Orkney and Scotland from Scandinavia, what I would expect is that the Beres would cluster within the blue Scandinavian barleys and not to one side. I just pointed out that the Faroe barleys were probably taken from Scotland to the Faroe Islands, and there we see those Faroe Island barleys clustering, the green ones clustering within the red Beres. The red Beres don't cluster in the blue Scandinavians. They're a sister group, and so that suggests that they have a common ancestor. They're not one derived from the other. The next slide, please. Okay, so this implies that Bere and the Scandinavian barleys evolved from a common ancestor. So this is one type of DNA analysis that we can do. There's a second type of DNA analysis which we can do, which is very similar to what happens when you send your DNA off to be sequenced to work out your DNA background. And when the results come back, they will say, for example, that you have 50% Scottish DNA, 30% English, 20%, 10% Irish, 10% French, or whatever. So your DNA can be assigned to different populations based on your ancestry. We can do exactly the same with barleys, especially when we've used a huge number of different barleys as we did in this study. The computer analysis can split those barleys into populations. It won't be Scottish, English, Irish. It will be more complicated populations. But nonetheless, we can then work out the affinities of the barleys to those different populations. And when we got the computer analysis to do this with all of the different DNA data we got from the 300 cultivated barleys and 200 wild barleys, we found that they fell into 16 populations. One of those populations contained all of the group 1 Beres and these Scandinavian barleys also. However, the interesting point which we discovered from that was that the Bere barleys were very pure single population. They weren't mixed. So the result which came back would be these are 100% Bere barley, 100% Bere group barleys. Whereas the Scandinavian barleys were a mixture of Bere population and other populations from Europe. What this suggests to us is that the Bere barleys and the Scandinavian barleys are indeed sister groups, but that the Bere barley is not derived from Scandinavia, is perhaps the other way around. So if we have the next slide, please. So when did they diverge? So if Bere is not derived from Scandinavia, if the Scandinavian barleys and Bere barleys are sister groups, then they must have come from a single origin, a type of barley that was introduced into northern Scotland at some point in prehistory. Barley cultivation first reached Scotland about 4,500, 3,500 years ago. That's what the archaeological record tells us. That was the first wave of introduction of agriculture into northern Scotland. However, this was not Bere, this was a naked type of barley. So this was definitely not the progenitor of Bere. Have the next slide, please. Okay, so this is the difference between naked and hulled. This is just a picture from Kew Gardens, which shows on the right-hand side hulled barley, which is the type of barley which we have with Bere, where the seed cases are enclosed tightly. The seeds are enclosed tightly in the seed cases. And then the naked barley, where the seed cases break open much more easily when the barley reaches maturity. And so this can be distinguished because in the archaeological record, the cases are recovered sometimes with the barley, and so we can tell if it's hulled or naked. And so naked barley on the left-hand side is what we had in Scotland originally. Next slide, please. Now, Bere, as I say, is a hulled barley, and the hulled barley is first seen in large amounts in Scotland during the Bronze Age about 1,000 years ago. And this is actually a little bit earlier than we see it in Scandinavia. However, in some sites in Scotland, in particular in Orkney, sites such as Toftoness and Poole on Sanday, we see hulled barley in quite large amounts a little bit earlier than this, maybe 2,000 years ago, back in the Neolithic period. So it would seem that hulled barley is first introduced into Northern Europe, perhaps in Scotland. We don't know where it comes from some other part of Europe, but it's introduced into the northern part of Europe, first of all into Scotland, and then later into Scandinavia. And so what this possibly indicates is that the origin of beer barley, or the relationship between beer barley and Scandinavian barley, is the reverse of what we assumed with the Viking idea. Rather than beer barley coming from Scandinavia, it's possibly that beer barley was the original, the Orkney barley was the original type of barley. But then this was taken to Scandinavia a few centuries or so afterwards. So in that suggests that the hulled barley, which was first seen in Scotland around 2,000 years ago, becomes common 1,000 years ago, maybe, or probably is, the progenitor of beer barley. Now, the next slide, please. So this means that beer is a Bronze Age barley. It may even be a Neolithic barley from earlier than that. And what makes this really interesting is that it's possibly the only variety from such antiquity which is still cultivated today in Europe. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, most of the barleys which are grown today are modern results of modern breeding programs in the 20th century. The old land races, which were formerly grown throughout Europe, have now become lost. They're only retained in seed collections. And I'm not personally aware of any other barley variety which can claim such an ancient origin, which is still being cultivated. And the same goes with wheat. Not so long ago, there was a small community in Asturias in Spain, which was growing a type of emmer wheat, which most certainly was descended from Neolithic emmer. But that community stopped growing emmer wheat now, so that's died out. So beer barley and Orkney barley could therefore be quite unique in being possibly the only Neolithic or Bronze Age barley, prehistoric barley, which is still grown today. Next slide, please. And then finally, I'd just like to thank people, the colleagues of mine at Manchester who did all the DNA work, collaborators at Orkney College, Peter Martin and John Wissart, who are responsible for growing the beer barley and for making us, first of all, aware of its interest. And the Heritage Beer Barley collection, which we use, was developed by the John Hutton Institute. Thank you very much for your attention.
Absolutely fascinating talk, Terry. Really, really got engrossed in there. Some interesting questions coming in. You mentioned about the beer barley can grow on very marginal, low nutrient ground. Do you know what the grain yield per hectare is for beer compared to modern barley varieties?
I don't know in specific terms, but I do know that when the work was being done on the ability of beer barley to take up nutrients from poor soils, there were some sandy soils where the more modern varieties of barley simply wouldn't grow at all, just were not productive, whereas beer barley could be grown. So the question really much relates to the type of yield. I think that I may be wrong here, but I think that where the conditions are, where the soils are very rich and strong, beer barley is probably outcompeted by the more modern types. But in the marginal areas, it's the other way around, which is what makes it so valuable at the sort of borders of barley cultivation in the north, which pretty much is Orkney's, Shetland is as far north as you can grow beer.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's kind of horses for courses, really, isn't it? I do know spring barleys, for beer and whiskey making, they yield about 8 to 9 tons per hectare, which is pretty high. But yeah, if they can't grow on very marginal soil, then there's no you get zero. So what's the point?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
I've got questions that have come in through Slido. Now, this is a good one. This is a kind of multiple question. It's got, do you think with the global shortage of fertilizers and perhaps the consequences of climate change forcing us to use even more marginal land, that beer barley or its selected genes and breeding programs could be used more extensively?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that the main interest that crop breeders and such like have in beer is the fact that it's a resource for genes for growth in marginal environments. And it's not just, I mean, climate change and overpopulation, reduction in availability of agricultural land is already pushing agriculture into areas where there may be high content of salt in the soil, as well as ones where the soils might be sandier and nutrient poor. And there's extensive work going on in crop breeding institutes attempting to take genes from wild barleys and take genes from barleys which are adapted already to these marginal environments and breed these into modern wheat. So the beer and in fact other land races of barley which are from marginal areas which are preserved in gene banks are in seed collections are tremendous sources of germplasm for hopefully improving modern varieties of barley, because there's going to be huge challenges with the way the environment is changing and the need to produce more and more food as every decade goes by.
Yeah, well, there's a huge investment gone into Dundee recently for looking at the how increased use of barley across the world. I think so. That's
yeah.
going to.
Yeah, see, barley actually is very adaptable, which is one of the reasons why it's more adaptable than wheat in this regard. Because originally barley was domesticated in the Near East, in areas of modern day Syria, Israel, and has spread from that environment into Europe and as far north as Orkney. And what I was particularly interested in when I was working at the university was the way in which the plants had to adapt to new environments as they were carried by the early farmers through Europe into much colder, more temperate climates, and then eventually into Britain, into Scandinavia. So the plants adapted as they were carried through Europe by Neolithic farmers. And so there's no reason why the plants can't adapt more. It's just we want them to adapt very quickly, which is why we're using modern breeding programs to carry out that adaptation, rather than sitting around for a century or so to wait for the plants to adapt themselves.
That's interesting, because I was going to ask you something about that. It was did the ancient peoples know how to cross flowering barleys, or did they just mix them in the field to produce new?
Well, there's actually a very, very detailed debate about this, and not just with the spread of agriculture, but the origins of agriculture. To what extent were early farmers conscious of what they were doing when they took plants into cultivation and prevented them from crossbreeding with wild plants and domesticated them, or was it done as purely a sort of a subconscious interaction between humans and plants, which led to the plants becoming domesticated? I think we probably don't credit our ancestors with the knowledge of natural history, which they had. There's a difference between understanding the natural world and actually being a real sort of scientist or a geneticist like Darwin or whatever. But I think you can perhaps understand simply through living in the natural world that things crossbreed, and if you prevent them crossbreeding, then you have a pure strain. And if something looks unusual and you isolate it, then you can carry on getting plants with that particular feature. So it is quite possible, I think, that the early Neolithic farmers and Bronze Age farmers had some kind of crop management, which enabled them to speed up the improvement of their crops, although not the same as the speed at which we can do it today with modern technologies.
No, I mean, science is really it's a methodology of doing something, a way of working. It doesn't mean that people didn't learn or fail by doing. It's
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. That's the farmers. So they would have grown their Bere barley or Bere derivatives, and they would have used them for baking or brewing or whatever. So would the best or the most suited to the land, the cultivars, have been self-selected by the farmers? That's another way that they maybe inadvertently improved the gene pool.
Yeah, well, there's an interesting question. Well, of course, the climate is continually changing, and it is an interesting question as to the extent of the furthest northernmost points at which barley could be cultivated, and whether there was a pause in the spread of agriculture before agriculture could move as far north as Scotland. Clearly, beer has evolved properties which suit it very much to growth in the Scottish Islands and Orkney and Shetland, even as far north as the Faroe Islands. But whether the first plants which were brought here by the Bronze Age and Neolithic farmers possess those properties, we don't know. If we could sequence from the ancient DNA, we might be able to type some of the genes and to understand the biochemistry of the earliest varieties. So again, the farmers who were cultivating beer in northern Scotland may have, well, perhaps through the cultivation methods, probably encouraged, if you like, the development of better varieties which were better suited for the types of environment in which they're being grown. And again, whether that was a planned process or something which just happened is very difficult.
You mentioned biochemistry of the varieties there, and here's a question related to that. It's what feature of Bere barley allows it to absorb nutrients more effectively? You know, it's physiological or biochemical.
Well, okay, I'd have to read the paper again to remember exactly what the conclusions were. I mean, so obviously nutrients are absorbed through the roots, and there are specific pathways which will transport trace elements like manganese and such like from the soil into the root and then translocate it around the plant. So it's a complicated question because there are so many different processes which can be affected. For instance, just the ability to absorb the manganese from the soil, then the ability to move it to different parts of the plant, and then the ability to actually utilize it in the biochemical processes in which manganese is used. And this is probably the same true for other trace elements. So I don't know exactly what the biochemical basis is. There are a number of different ones. And I'm not sure if that was actually discovered in the study. I think probably the study was more looking at the physiological properties and the rate of uptake. And it would be interesting if we could isolate particular genes for transporter proteins or such like, and see how those are working, because that would be the key thing that we would want to transfer to other types of barley we want to try and grow on nutrient poor soils.
Yeah, that the family tree you refer to, that was superb. And one of the questions that's come in is, how many years did it take to establish that family tree of the Scandinavian Bere? And
yeah, okay, well, because I had a number of dedicated researchers who were listed on that last slide who worked day and night slavishly doing it. It actually was about 5 years work. But in fact, the largest amount of the work was trying to untangle the genetic data in a bioinformatics sense. So taking the raw data provided by the company that did the DNA typing and converting that into something which we could actually analyze was actually the major challenge. But it involved initially doing a DNA extraction from 500 different seeds of barley, some of which had to be germinated before we could get the DNA out of them. And so Karen and Haley and Sandra and others in my lab would be working 7 days a week, extracting DNA day after day after day in order to get the data. Once you get the data, the computers are so powerful that they can do the analyses in a very short time. But it's actually getting the DNA, getting all the sequence data is a lengthy process. Fortunately, once you become a professor, you don't have to do that yourself. You just employ other people to do it.
That's actually there's other questions related to this again that's come in. Is how many different occupation types or science disciplines come together to build that type of ancestry?
Well, I mean, this is the thing which was fascinating by the sort of work which I did, was that it was partly archaeology, partly DNA. And I'm personally a DNA person. My wife is an archaeologist. And so the two of us worked together largely on bones. And then I became interested also working on agriculture, but I employed people who were archaeologists, even ancient historians, along with others who had degrees in genetics or computation, and tried to teach all of them the skills they didn't know, which strangely, perhaps the archaeologists found it easier to learn how to study DNA than the DNA people learned to understand archaeology. Not sure why that is. Possibly the fact that they all thought they knew it already because they'd seen it on TV. Whereas, you know, the archaeologists knew that DNA might be more of a challenge.
Excellent. Well, Terry, I am going to conclude there. We've got a little bit of festival housekeeping to do, but can I just thank, first of all, the audience for typing in all the questions via YouTube live chat and also Slido, which I'm going to say I found very easy to use and excellent way of drawing the questions together to give back to Terry. And Terry, seriously, absolutely fascinating talk. I really enjoyed it. What you probably don't know is that my career was in barley malting and distilling.
All right. Okay. So
and one time I was chair of the Institute of Brewing and Distilling Barley Committee. So this was absolutely right up my street, and I was desperate to speak or host this one. So
okay, it's been a pleasure.
Thank you very, very much for doing that for me.
Okay, thank you.
So what I'm going to do is a little bit of festival housekeeping. So for festival goers here in Orkney, our next talk is live in the Stromness Town Hall and is called The Surge of Wave and Tide and Hydrogen, all about Orkney developments and renewables, and it begins at 5:15 p.m. Following that, the next event, which is also in person, is in the Orkney Theatre at Kirkwall Grammar School, and it's about what makes viruses tick, and it begins at 7:30 p.m. And this will be an event which will inevitably have you scratching your heads. It's about ticks and the diseases they carry, an increasing problem in Scotland. So don't forget to like us on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram, and please subscribe to our YouTube channel. Once again, Terry, thanks very much. And also to the invisible tech team in the background who magically enable these events to be brought to you. For now, until the next time, goodbye.